just a standard digital camera, but it has a motion detector on it. So that little rectangular shape down in the lower portion of the camera is the motion sensor. It's similar to what you have in a standard household burglar alarm. So when an animal moves in front of that sensor, it triggers the camera to take photos, or in some cases videos. Different cameras have different capabilities. And these are increasingly being used for monitoring all sorts of wildlife. And these are just some examples of some of the animals that we've been using cameras to monitor here in Aotearoa. So these tools were originally developed and designed with fairly large animals in mind, mostly game animals like deer, and also things like big cats. But in more recent years, we've been adapting the use of these cameras for much smaller species, the sorts of pests that we're often interested in here in New Zealand. And not only pests, it's important to remember that these cameras are also very useful for monitoring native species, including things like kiwi. But in order to target small species, we have to deploy the cameras slightly differently. So if I go back again to that previous slide, you see there that in both these cases, the camera is looking at quite a large field of view, quite a large area. But if a small animal like a rat or a stoat was to run across one of those fields of view, you'd have a hard time seeing it in the photograph. It wouldn't be much use at all. So instead, the way we target these small species is to have the camera looking at a much smaller area, and we have to use a lure, because otherwise the chances of the animal just happening to pass through that few square meters would be quite small. So those white plastic bottles that you can see there contain a lovely scent lure, which brings in all sorts of animals, including, as you can see, mustelids, cats, hedgehogs. It's attracted to rats as well. It's a really, really effective lure. And there are a number of ways that we can use the data that we get from camera traps. They're really great for species that have unique markings. And this was a technique that was first developed for tigers. So individual tigers have unique stripe patterns. Everyone all right back there? And so by identifying the unique patterns of stripes, they can identify individuals, and you can actually estimate population size using the same sorts of statistical methods that people use when they catch animals and, for example, put unique ear tags on them and then recapture them. You can do the exact same thing with the photographs you get from these cameras. And that's where the term camera trap actually comes from, because people use them in the same way that you might use a live capture trap. But of course, not all species have unique individual markings. As you probably know, if you've seen a lot of feral cats, a lot of them are just uniform black. So you can't use this sort of mark recapture type modelling in those cases, but you can still get a pretty good idea of the distribution and the relative numbers of animals in space. And this is just one example from one of our projects in Hawke's Bay. So each of these dots represents the location of one of our cameras. And the green dots are cameras that detected no cats, yellow is one cat, through to orange, 3 or 4, and then red were cameras that detected lots of cats. So it's not giving us exact numbers, but it's still giving us a reasonable picture of where cats are more or less abundant in that landscape. And also gives you a good idea of the species distribution. Another cool thing about camera traps is that they record the exact date and time that they take every photograph. So you can get really good information on animal behaviour and things like animals' daily activity patterns. So this is some work that was recently published by my colleague Patrick Garvey, and he was looking at the daily activity patterns of feral cats, ferrets and stoats all in the same area. And you can see there, so the top graph is cats compared to ferrets, and their activity patterns are very similar. They were both active mainly at night, and that trough there is during the daytime hours when both species were relatively inactive. Then the bottom two graphs are comparing cats and ferrets with stoats, and you can see that they have almost the exact opposite activity patterns. So stoats were actually mainly active during the day in this particular location. This was in Hawke's Bay. And what we think is happening there is that stoats are actually avoiding the risk of encountering cats and ferrets because they're a threat to stoats. So stoats are basically forced to be active during the daytime in order to avoid the risk of being killed by one of the larger predators. So this example is showing avoidance between species in terms of their times of activity. Another thing you can pick up from camera traps is if different species might be avoiding each other in space. So one species might be active in a particular habitat type and the other species might be active somewhere else, and you can pick that up from cameras as well. So you get all sorts of really useful information. They're also great for identifying nest predators. And a couple of photos here that were provided by Grant Norbury from Anaki Whenua. These were braided riverbeds in Mackenzie country in the South Island. You can see there a hedgehog and a feral cat both stealing eggs from ground nesting birds. And then the top photo there is one from Australia, a goanna, once again stealing an egg from a ground nesting bird. And occasionally, just through dumb luck, you get really cool stuff like that. We captured this stoat killing a rabbit that was about 3 times its own size. So they're really excellent tools, camera traps. They can collect all sorts of really useful and interesting information, but there's one big problem with them, and that is that they don't just take photos of the things that we're interested in. It's a real pain in the bum if you're using cameras on farms. You end up with thousands and thousands of photos of sheep and cattle.
Or the bush.
Pardon?
Or in the bush.
Or in the bush sometimes, yep. And also the cameras can be triggered by vegetation swaying in the breeze. So for example, that flax bush that you can see in the background there, in a good stiff breeze, that would be capable of triggering the camera as well. So you can end up with thousands and thousands of photos that contain nothing of interest, and it's really, really time consuming and costly to process all of these images manually, which is what led us in recent years to start developing artificial intelligence that can identify animal species in photographs. So we've developed this software that we're calling CamTrapNZ, and this is going to be freely available online on the website TrapNZ. And a lot of you probably use TrapNZ already for recording trapping data, so you can now also use it to record camera trap data, and very soon, as in any day now, you will be able to process your images using artificial intelligence. So this platform will allow you to not only identify the animal species, but also produce maps and charts of your results. And you can choose whether to make your data publicly available to anyone that wants to see, or you can store them privately. That's entirely up to the user. So I've just got a few screenshots here to illustrate the way that this tool is going to work. So these are some camera traps that Auckland Council have in the Hunua ranges for monitoring things like feral pigs, cats and mustelids. And the user can record the numbers of particular species detected on each camera. So in this case, these were numbers of feral cats captured on camera. So the green dots are cameras that detected one cat, and the red dots detected higher numbers of cats. So at the moment, the software has been trained to recognise a range of pest species, including mustelids, possums, cats. It will also recognise kiwi But in any other bird species, it will simply label it as a bird. It doesn't recognise any other individual bird species as yet. It will also recognise livestock, so that you just don't need to look at those images, they're not of interest. And there's the potential to add more species in future. So, for example, we're collecting sample images of dogs at the moment. We want to add those, and potentially we could add other species as well. So the way that the software will work is that the user zooms in on one of their particular camera traps on the map. So you would have stored the locations of all the camera traps using GPS points. And then, it's a pity that the pointer does, oh, it does work actually, yeah, there we go. So you zoom in on the particular camera trap and you click upload images here, and the camera will take you to this screen where you can simply drag and drop the images. So you might have them saved on an external hard drive, or it might just be the memory card directly removed from the camera. You just drag and drop your images into this thing here and click go. Oh, first click upload. And so it will upload all of those images and associate them with that camera trap. So the data are stored in the cloud. And you have the option at this point of, you can manually tag the images if you want to, identify the species manually, and that might be useful, for example, for public outreach or for things like school projects, where it's perhaps more interesting to actually go through the photos rather than just rely on the software to do it for you. Or you can just decide to tell the computer to do all the hard work for you. So you just click on this button here that says Match with AI, and it will churn through the images for you. At the moment, they're just upgrading the speed of the server so that this will be able to run quite quickly. It should be able to do several images per second, so it'll process them quite fast. And then what the software will produce will be a gallery with a little thumbnail of each image. And here it tells you the date and time, the species identified, and it also gives you a confidence rating. So in this case, it's 99% certain that that is a hedgehog, and you can sort the results in order of decreasing confidence. So you might set a particular threshold. Say, for example, if the AI is less than 70% confident, then you might decide to manually check those ones, just to check that it has actually identified the correct species. You can also filter your results by species, or zoom in on particular cameras, or zoom in on a particular range of dates. So there's various ways that you can explore your results. So that's where the software is at the moment, but it is still a work in progress, and our main priority at the moment is to continue to improve the accuracy of the species identification. So I'm sorry, that's a bit small for you to read on there, I'm sorry about that, but these are just tables showing the percentage of images that are correctly identified, and we have nighttime images on the top and day at the bottom. So these cameras generally take black and white images at night, and it's a little bit more difficult to identify species in those because you can't see colours, and also sometimes the images are a bit more grainy. So the accuracy is a bit lower for night images, but we're still, and again I'm sorry you can't read these, but most of these accuracy figures are in the 80 to 90% range. Here for wallabies it's 98% accurate, that's pretty darn good. Our lowest accuracy at the moment is for feral cats, it's only about 68%, so we want to continue to improve that. And one way that we should be able to improve that is cameras generally take what we call a burst of photos every time that they're triggered, so it might be, depending on the settings, it might take 3, 5 or maybe even 10 images each time the movement sensor is triggered. At the moment, the software just looks at every image individually, but the next step will be to tell it, no, these are bursts of 3. So if there's a cat in the first photo, then it's probably a cat in photo number 2 and 3 as well. So we'll look at them in these discrete parcels and say, okay, that burst of photos is a cat. And that should improve the accuracy quite a lot, because what you often see is that the first photograph just has the cat's nose just on the edge of the shot, and the cat is mostly out of shot. Second image is a beautiful photo of the cat, and then the third image is just the tip of its tail as it's walked out the other side again. So, not surprisingly, the AI looks at that and goes, well, the first and the third one, I don't know what that is, but the second one was the cat. So, as soon as it understands that all 3 images are of the same animal, then it's going to have a much better chance of correctly identifying them. So that should improve the accuracy quite substantially. We're also looking at training the AI to cope with different camera orientations. So mostly people set cameras horizontally, so set parallel with the ground. But you can also set them a bit higher up, as in this example, looking directly down at the ground. And that has a few advantages. One is that it can drastically reduce the number of false triggers, so you're not going to have as much problem with things like vegetation blowing in the breeze with this setup. But it does require different training of the AI to recognise animals from above rather than from the side. So we have adapted it so far to recognise possums from above, and we hope to train it to recognise other species for that as well. And we're also considering other types of camera track setups. And one is this setup that's been invented in Australia. They're called the selfie trap. So there's a camera inside this tube, and small animals, in this case this is a sugar glider, and this one here is a small carnivorous marsupial, roughly mouse-sized. And as you can see, it gets really nice close-up photographs of the face, and that can be really useful for animals that have unique facial markings. So that could be a good way for monitoring and even identifying individual stoats. So although it's very subtle, if you get very close-up images of stoat faces, they all have unique white markings on their face. Just looking quickly at some technology that's been developed by the Cacophony project. So this is not our work, but it's pretty exciting. They've been looking at using artificial intelligence similar to ours, but with thermal cameras. And their trials are suggesting that thermal cameras might be anywhere between 3 times and 50 times as sensitive as a conventional camera. This is just an example of an image of a possum captured on a thermal camera, and you can see there the artificial intelligence has identified as a possum with a confidence of 8.7 out of 10, or 9.1 out of 10 actually. And probably a little bit further down the track, we're hoping to develop what we're calling smart traps, where we would have a camera attached to a trap which will identify an animal approaching, and it can do several things. One that's really quite important is if it identifies a non-target animal. So for example, a kiwi or a weka is approaching a trap, it'll disarm the trap so that there's no risk of harming the non-target animal. And that could be a real game changer, because it will allow us to place ground set traps in areas with kiwi and weka, which you can't do at the moment. And obviously that's a major obstacle to eradication if you've got vast areas where you can't put traps on the ground. But as well as disarming for non-target species, these traps could also potentially identify, for example, that's a cat, so I'm going to play the sound of another cat or squirt out a scent that cats like, or it might say that's a ferret, so I'm going to play a different sound and squirt out a different scent. And so it might be able to greatly increase our probability of capturing particular species. And this is an example that's been developed in Australia of a tool that's doing something vaguely along these lines. It's called Wild Dog Alert. They're placing these on farms where they have a problem with wild dogs killing sheep. So it's a camera that it has a 360-degree view, and as soon as it detects a dog, it will just send out a text message to the farmer saying there's a dog here right now, come and shoot it. So we're looking at similar options to that, but with a view to modifying traps to capture certain species and ignore non-target species. Okay, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.